we didn't become the alpha species on this planet Earth because we're the largest species, or because we're the fastest species, or because we're the strongest species, or because we have the largest brain, right? We actually became this alpha species because we empathize and we collaborate and we communicate with each other really well.
Fire, earth, wind, water. This is the Elemental Educator. And now your host, Tyler Como.
Hello and welcome to the Elemental Educator podcast. I'm your host, Tyler, and today we are joined by Dr. Mark Williams, an internationally recognized neuroscience professor with over 25 years experience conducting behavioral and brain imaging research, focusing on our social skills and how we learn. He has received numerous awards for teaching and research, taught the fundamentals of neuroscience to everyone from kindy kids to adults, published more than 70 scientific articles, and worked at MIT, USA, and multiple universities in Australia. Mark draws on his extensive scientific background to work with organizations to develop evidence-based practices using neuroscience to improve productivity, innovation, and mental health. Mark's new book, The Connected Species, is a #1 bestseller, and his work has been highlighted in the media, including The Guardian UK, New York Times, Forbes, The Economist, and New Scientists. Welcome to the Elemental Educator podcast, Dr. Williams. It is a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for having me, Tyler. Really good to be here.
The pleasure is all mine, Mark, and I'm so happy that I get to learn from you, along with the listeners get to learn from you and your story. And I want to go to the big question right away, which is, how did you get to where you are now?
I'm in my 50s now, so that could take a while. How did I get to here? I don't really know. It was a very windy road. But not one that I would change because it made me who I am today. I grew up in a small country town in Victoria, which is down the bottom of Australia. It was very high unemployment in Australia, especially in country towns back then. And my mother had a mental illness, so I actually hated school when I was at school. And my principal actually told me that I'd be dead or in prison by the time I was 25, when I was about 15. Wow. So I wasn't very academic at all. And it wasn't until I was like 25 that I had two friends who had drug overdoses, and it made me realize that I wanted to change something. So I went back to school, and I had an amazing physics teacher that convinced me that I was actually bright enough to go to university, which I'd never thought I was. So I did. I went to university and did science, and then did a PhD in medicine, and then ended up working at MIT, which is pretty cool.
That's incredible. And Mark, we could, for each little micro story you just told there, we could do entire episodes unpacking what that is. I want to dive into our earth element, though, which represents core values and rooting yourself in your beliefs. How have your core values guided your journey from, a small town in Victoria to becoming an internationally recognized professor of cognitive neuroscience? And how do these values influence your work today in making neuroscience accessible to the general public?
Yeah, it's a great question. When I read that, I was sort of thinking about how my values have really changed. I don't think I had values for the first 25 years or so. It wasn't until I had the experience of that teacher, and then when we went to university and fell in love with learning, that I think I really established my values. And I think that's one of the big problems in society today, is that a lot of people don't recognize or don't have values that they actually work on. And I think with everyone, they change throughout your life, but I think we all need to be thinking about what our values are at this point in time, because we're constantly evolving, and we're constantly a work in practice. My most important value now is collaboration, is understanding that we've all got something to contribute, and loving that aspect of us as humans, that we can all contribute to each other and teach each other lessons. I was on a train the other day to the airport, and a gentleman got on, and he looked pretty scruffy, and he had a bottle of wine in his hand, and he was a native Australian, Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander. And I just smiled and said hello, and he was very, happy to chat. And it turns out he's the grandson of probably one of the most famous Aboriginal people here in Australia, Marbo, who actually changed a lot of the laws here in Australia. It was fascinating to have the opportunity to talk to him, and him talking about, his great grandfather, and how what that was like growing up in that small country town when his grandfather was going through all that political stuff that he went through. I mean, that was, and that was just somebody on a train who probably most people wouldn't have even looked at. So I think that's probably my main one at the moment, which I've moved towards, which is everyone's got value and we should be chatting to them all.
Thank you so much for sharing. And, sharing that one of your core values is that idea of collaboration really makes me think back to an earlier episode I recorded, the transformative principle in Canada. His name is Jethro Drones. He gave a very powerful quote to me, which is, while the people at the bottom are busy competing, the people at the top are too busy collaborating. And there's something to be said about that idea of collaboration and a collective mindset. I just, in Canada, teachers are just coming back to work. Kids are just getting ready to return to school. And one of the messages we just talked with our staff about was the mindset of having collective teacher efficacy. And we dove into the research that John Hattie put together around what is optimal practice, and collective teacher efficacy was at the top, that idea of collaboration. Now, you share a very vulnerable thing, which is you didn't have values and you found them. How did you go about finding what they were?
I think one of the things, when I was doing my undergraduate in science, and I was majoring in psychology and physiology, neurophysiology specifically, I decided I wanted to learn more about people. And so I volunteered at a hospice. It was an end-of-life hospice, but to actually become a volunteer, you had to go through a whole training program. And so this was people who were at the last 2 weeks of their life, and so they went there to actually die. And so I went through this pretty intense training program. And during that, we really had to get in touch with who we were and what we valued and why we were there. And it was very intense.
It would be,
more for me than for the people that I worked with. And so that's when I first really started getting in touch with what my core values were and what I actually wanted to shape in me and focus more on.
Now, a little off script here, but you shared collaboration as one of the values. Are you willing to share a few of the other ones that are close to you?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, absolutely. And another one is respect. I think we all need to have respect for each other. And again, it goes back to that whole idea that we all have something to offer. And we're all living our best lives at this moment. And we never know what's happening in someone's personal lives. And especially with teachers, I mean, I really feel for teachers because you've got, 15, 20, 25 students coming into your classroom and you never know what's happened to them prior to with them walking in, or last night or last week or whatever. And so, having respect for everybody that we meet. And I was always told by my father, and I didn't realize that until I was much older, he treated everybody the same. It didn't matter who you were or what you did. Everybody was exactly the same and treated exactly the same. And I try to do that wherever I am and whenever I'm around people, because I think that's really important.
And Dr. Jody Carrington says it best. It's not so much what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. What events occurred that led to who you are now. Now, shifting a bit, your background is described as colorful. And at one point, your life could have taken a very different direction. How did your core beliefs, if they were there at the time, weren't there at the time, how did they help you navigate those challenging times and steer you toward an academic and professional success?
That was through the teacher. I mean, that's why I have so much respect for teachers. That was through my physics teacher, who I had, I think because I was a mature age student, and most of the students there at TAFE, or what you call a community college, I think in Canada, were much younger. He sort of, we both were right into records and into grunge was big at the time, and we were both into grunge. So we used to talk a lot about that. And he really convinced me that I had more to offer and that I should go to university. And so that's really what spurred my interest. And then I got to university and there was all these wonderful people who had wonderful insights into the world, right? And that spurred me on even more. And then I started getting into psychology and into neurophysiology and understanding our brains and understanding what had gone wrong with my mother, who had mental illness. And it just sort of went from there. It just snowballed from there. I really loved it. And I think because I had all the experiences before that, it enabled me to connect with a lot of people at different levels. And so I was really lucky, and I was accepted into that whole academic sphere.
That's wonderful. And in your work with schools and businesses, what core principles do you emphasize to ensure that the neuroscience concepts you teach are both accessible and impactful for your audience?
Yeah, the big one's connection. I think we've lost a lot of that connection these days. And I think what we need to understand, I mean, we didn't become the alpha species on this planet Earth because we're the largest species, or because we're the fastest species, or because we're the strongest species, or because we have the largest brain, right? We actually became this alpha species because we empathize and we collaborate and we communicate with each other really well, and we learn from each other, and we learn across generations, with no other species actually does. And that's what teachers do, right? And that's why teachers are so valuable. So when I'm working with organizations or with schools, it's always comes from that point of view, is that our brains have actually evolved for us to connect and for us to collaborate. And we've got to do that. We've got to connect first before we can teach. We've got to connect first before we can collaborate. And so coming from that point of view and learning the important tools to actually doing that and connecting with either students or connecting with work colleagues, so that we can collaborate, so we feel like we actually want to actually help each other. But we know we don't collaborate with people who we don't connect with, right? And we don't learn from people who we don't connect with. Beautiful study done recently where they put EEG headsets on both the teacher and all the students. And they showed that the students that the teacher was connected with, their brains started oscillating together and when they're actually being taught something. And so they actually sync up when they're actually connected with each other. And the students who weren't connected with the teacher didn't sync up. But then they looked at what happened when they were synced up, and whether or not they remembered the information. And the students remembered the information when they was in sync, and when they're out of sync, they didn't remember the information the teacher was teaching them. So, it's so important for us to make that connection first. And we've got to remember that our brains are the same squishy grey matter that they were 25,000 years ago. Right? They haven't changed in the last 25,000 years. So we were hunter-gatherers back then, and we were spending lots of time together, and we were actually really connected to each other, and we were learning from the more senior people there. And so learning is something we do really easily and really quickly, but it's when we're connected, when we feel as though we're part of that group. So that's one of the things we work on first.
And you talk about collaboration. It is so important. And I love that you went back to the reptilian brain, because it's still in us. And we talk about the idea of fight, flight, or freeze. And we get to the idea that, most of the time, without collaboration, we're always going to be in fight mode. Our brain is going to not create that link to go to cognitive thinking. We're going to get stuck in emotional behavioral thought. We're going to have fight responses, and we're not going to go back for that second opinion. And when you have collaboration, when you have that idea of learning together, you're creating a space where your brain can move past the first stage of flight and come back for second thought. And then you can get to your cognitive learning. And that's that in sync part you're talking about. That's so effective and so powerful. Now, with
absolutely.
that, Mark, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah. And we know that you don't learn if you're correct, right? So if you're correct, if you get something right, you haven't learned anything because you actually knew it already. That's why you got it correct. You only learn when you actually get things wrong, and you get corrected by the teacher. And you're not going to actually be willing to listen to that correction unless you're actually connected with the teacher, unless you're actually calm and relaxed and in a state where you trust the teacher, you trust what they're saying. Whereas if you're in that negative space, then you're not going to want to actually listen to the teacher who's correcting you. And so you're not going to learn anything. So it's so important to have that.
Yep. And learning is the process of going from incompetence to competence back to incompetence again, and it's a vicious cycle that goes over and over again. But with that, Mark, air symbolizes embracing and overcoming adversity. Can you share a significant challenge you faced in your journey, particularly during your transition from a colorful youth to an accomplished neuroscientist, and how you overcame it?
Yeah, it was, again, it's through having people that I was connected with, right? It was actually having people that I could go to. I was my core friends at that stage took a lot of drugs and did a lot of, partying, and I needed to get out of that. So having family and friends that I could say, hey, can I sleep on your couch, so that I can get away from people who, I shouldn't be around, because, it's habitual, right? A lot of this behavior is habitual. And so being able to shift from that one group to another group and having a range of groups that I was actually friends with really allowed me to do that. And so having, lots of different people, and people who would support me and knew that I was trying to do something positive in my life, meant that I was able to shift to a more positive arrangement, if you like, or a more positive environment, and therefore then study and therefore do well.
And moving from we'll call it a challenging early life, to a career at prestigious institutions like MIT and universities in Australia, it must have involved overcoming some significant barriers. What specific adversities did you face there, and how did you find that resilience to succeed?
Yeah, I've always, everybody talks about imposter syndrome, and I think that's very strong. It was very strong in me. It still is. I still get very nervous, which seems ridiculous when I do so many presentations these days. But yeah, it was the whole imposter syndrome, and did I really deserve to be here? And had I actually earned it? I was at MIT with other colleagues who had worked their asses off all their lives, right? They'd got credible marks all through school and so on. And here I was, a dropout who'd then gone to a community college and struggled through, and then ended up being successful. And so having that to compete with was really difficult, and was a real struggle for a long time. I was lucky because once you get to university, people only really care about what you know now, not what you've done before, which is beautiful. And it's one thing whenever I talk to students, especially more senior students, is one thing I really try and talk to them about. I do a lot of work with kids in gangs and so on, about the fact that they can change their lives. And if they get into university, that's an opportunity for a complete reset, because, once you get to university, then no one's going to look at whether you got expelled from a school or whether you got suspended or whatever. And so, having that, getting past that idea that I really didn't deserve it because these people had worked all their lives and I'd been lucky.
And there's two mindsets there to that. I'm in my doctorate right now, and the very first course I did, I was questioning grades. I was wondering why I got them. And then I reflected on that, and I go, these don't even matter. No one's going to look and say, how did you do on your doctorate course A? How did you do on B? And I stopped caring about it. And boy, did I just dive into what I wanted to do. And it was so much more beneficial to the work that I'm trying to do out there. And it changes how you feel about imposter syndrome, because you no longer look at the grade and say, well, maybe I'm not supposed to be here. And I think, a very interesting study that I hope can be done on a global scale at some point is the idea and the effect that empowerment has on removing imposter syndrome. I start every year off by reminding my teachers, you are the expert. You're the expert in your room. We brought you here for a reason. You have this position because you know it the best. I don't know it the best, and I can help you as best as I can, but you're there living it. You see it every day. You're the expert, and we need to trust your judgment. And those simple conversations empower these people, and they start to feel less like imposters and more like they belong where they're supposed to be. So, maybe we're sparking a study here that can happen that studies the effects of empowerment on imposter syndrome.
Yeah, I love that. That'd be great. Because it is pervasive. Imposter syndrome, everybody talks about it. And it'd be great to look at something.
It has to do somehow with mirror neurons and seeing what's around you and tricking yourself into thinking you're not there, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Now, in your programs focused on brain health and neuroscience, how do you help individuals and organizations overcome the adversities posed by modern technologies, such as the impact of smartphones on our brains?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a really difficult issue at the moment. And so most of what I talk about is just getting restrictions on the phones, the problem with the phones is that they're constantly distracting us. We know those beeps and buzzes and those things are constantly capturing our attention, which then wipes our working memory, which means that we're not actually, focusing on what we should be focusing on. So simply by getting rid of the phones for periods of time means that you can actually focus on one thing and actually get stuff done. And so whether it's not it's an organization or it's school, it's just about getting rid of the phones and using them as they should be used, which is when you actually need to communicate with someone elsewhere. All right. When you're in a classroom, you don't need to communicate with someone elsewhere. You need to communicate with the teacher. So there shouldn't be any devices in that case. You should be not one-on-one, but you should be communicating with the people in that room and not thinking about what's happening elsewhere. And so we need to get rid of them. And same with organizations. If you're in a meeting, there's no reason to have smartphones in the meeting because you're in the meeting to talk to the people who are actually there. And I think we need to get to a point where we realize that it's the person in front of you in that room that's the most important person, not somebody dinging you on your phone.
I would love to see the effect of those kids that were in sync on an EEG when they have access to their phone and they're on their phone, and if it throws them out of sync and what that does, because we know that if they're in sync, it benefits what they're able to learn. And does the phone throw them out of sync? That would be something that I'm wondering right now. And not only that, you're so right. And the problem with it is we're so reliant and dependent on the technology and on the cell phone that taking it away is a fight, and it's a problem. And, I've got a 2.5-year-old at home, and we're all guilty at, you need to make supper, so you put something on. And, the days that we put something on are the days we have more behavior. Yeah. Those are the days that we're fighting a lot more. And fighting's not the right word, but we're more challenged by each other. And something needs to change. Now, speaking of change, Mark, water represents the ability to implement change. How have you driven meaningful change in the fields of education and neuroscience, particularly through your programs that bring cutting-edge research to schools and businesses?
Yeah, great question. It's a lot around actually realizing how our brains work and how our brains have actually evolved, and that's to actually collaborate, to actually look at someone in the eye, talk to them, collaborate with them, and actually make those connections. And so that's the thing that I really focus on, because we know more of our brains dedicated to that than anything else we do. And we know that if you look at any of the top performing companies, they have a lot of restrictions on when they can use devices and when they can't use devices. Google has areas where devices are allowed and areas where they're not allowed, because they know that they need areas where they're not allowed so that people can actually collaborate in those areas. And if you look at top performing schools or top performing districts, or top performing countries when it comes to outcomes, they have very few devices in their actual schools, because they know, again, that by decreasing the number of devices and limiting them to programs where you actually need a device rather than where it's just easier, you get much better outcomes because the students are connected to the teacher and the students are actually working better with the teacher. And then talking about how we connect and how we've evolved to connect and how important it is to do that. And so, mirror neurons and the C fibers in our skin around touch, and simply going to the door for a teacher, simply going to the door and shaking the hand of each student as they enter the room will release oxytocin and serotonin in their brain, which will make them more connected to the teacher, which means that they're going to be more settled and they're going to learn better from the teacher. I mean, it's a really simple thing to do, but it actually makes a huge difference to us as humans, because we have these C fibers in our skin which release those neurotransmitters simply to make us more connected. There's lots of, really simple ways we can improve learning, and we can improve collaboration, we can improve innovation, creativity, by just thinking about how our brains have evolved and using them in those ways, and then using technology to do the stuff that our brains aren't very good at, which unfortunately we don't do. I mean, the thing that I find crazy is I don't want artificial intelligence to be writing books for me or to be drawing pictures for me. I want to be doing those things, and I want to have the time to do those things. And I'd like AI to be cleaning the house and to be doing the dishes. And
right?
To be cooking
there we go.
You know what I mean? Like, let's design this technology to do all the stuff that we don't want to do, rather than designing it to do the stuff we want to do, so it takes our jobs.
Well, exactly.
It just seems ridiculous at the moment. We're chasing, going down the wrong route.
Absolutely.
Completely.
And not just for teachers, not just for principals, leaders, listen to this. If you want to build a connection, if you want to see improvement, step one is think about your proximity to the people you're working with. If you are physically distancing yourself from people, it will impact your organization. As something as simple as a handshake. It doesn't even need to be a handshake. Standing at a door and greeting, open door policies. When somebody's coming into your office or workspace to greet you, don't be sitting at your desk in your seat waiting for them to come. Greet them at the door. That proximity is so important for just showing people you care.
Absolutely.
Now, your decision to take voluntary redundancy and focus on making neuroscience accessible to the public was a significant shift. What changes have you implemented in your approach to ensure that complex scientific concepts are understandable and useful for a wider audience?
I'll give you a little anecdote before that. It was the most stupid thing I could have done because I did it in the middle of COVID, thinking COVID was over, and then of course COVID wasn't over at all. So that killed me for a good 12 months. But that meant I wrote my book, so that was probably good. But yeah, it was a bad timing issue. But I was really, really fortunate. I had two postdoctoral supervisors, one at Melbourne University and then one at MIT, who really emphasized to me and to everyone who was in their lab that if you're not able to communicate in simple terms that somebody can understand, then you don't understand it yourself. And it's something that I took away and I've always really focused on. And it doesn't matter who I'm talking to or especially when I'm teaching, that I've always kept it simple enough for everybody in the audience to actually understand it, because otherwise it shows that I don't understand it. And there's a lot of people, several people who do podcasts, to be honest, who use words that I don't think they really understand themselves. And they just do it to make themselves look smart. And it doesn't make them look smart. It makes them look pretty stupid, because it makes people who actually understand the content realize that they don't know what they're talking about. So keeping things simple is something that I've always really focused on. And I've always got, very good responses from all of my students at university because of that, because I'm not trying, I'm in there making it simple enough for everybody. It doesn't matter where they're sitting or where they've come from to understand it and to be able to get a good mark if they want to get a good mark. And so that's how I've always, and I keep doing that. And the first course I started doing in schools was neuroscience for kinder kids. So that's where I started with kinder kids, and I loved it, and they loved it. Some of the stuff they come up with is just amazing, better than some of my PhD students in their ideas that they come up with. So yeah, I love doing it, and I love enabling everybody to create environments where their brains are healthier and friendly environments, so their brains are healthy so they can thrive.
It's so apparent to me just in the conversation so far, Mark, that from hearing about the adversity you faced to these changes that you've implemented, it might not appear that way, but they are rooted in these values you've identified. For me, every single thing we've talked about was rooted in that mindset of collaboration. And it's so intentional in the work you're doing that you're putting forth collaborative efforts. The conversation you're having right now about, if you try to overspeak yourself, you're not trying to collaborate, you're trying to impress, right? You're not trying to work with somebody. You're trying to force their respect to you through your knowledge. And that's not how you get your second value of respect. You get it through being genuine in your collaboration with them. Now, in your work with rethinking the brain, how do you approach the challenge of implementing brain health initiatives in schools, especially when dealing with entrenched habits and the pervasive influence of technology?
It's tough, to be honest, because it really is, it really is entrenched. And there seems to be this real mindset in schools that technology is essential, and it's not essential. I mean, we've got to realize that, multiple CEO of NVIDIA, which is, makes the chips in most computers, has came out very recently and said coding will be redundant within 5 years. There'll be no reason to learn coding. It'll be like learning an ancient language. And Elon Musk has just come out and done the same thing to all his employees. Said those that are they're just coding will have to find a new job very soon because we don't need it anymore because of AI. So, why we're spending huge amounts of time on devices in schools when we know that there aren't jobs in there. And the biggest growth industry in any Western country over the last 25, 30 years has been the health industry, right? And the health industry, you don't need to be good on a computer. You don't need to be able to code. You need to be good at collaborating. You need to be good at verbalizing what you need. You need to be good at actually facial expressions and empathizing and collaborating and doing all those things, right? And you learn those by interacting with people, not sitting on a computer and learning how to code. And also we know that the laptops are going to be gone very soon. Apple's significantly decreased development of laptops because of voice recognition. So voice recognition is becoming so good now that we're going to get rid of the keyboards and people will just speak and it'll all be text, speech to text. So, to be teaching kids how to be doing these things that we know are going to become redundant within the next 5 to 10 years, seems very odd to me. And I think once people start thinking about that, I think they start realizing, and especially when you actually see all the research showing that you actually learn better on paper than you do on a device. You don't have the stress and you don't have the anxiety and you don't have the suicidal tendencies increase, right, after 3 or 4 hours on a device and all these things. So we need to realize that it's not improving learning, it's actually decreasing learning. And a lot of the time, once people realize that, they want to change, but then they've got to put the effort into the change, and that's the hard bit. But it's great when it happens, and I've seen some amazing schools that have made the transition, and it's fantastic to see what happens when the transition happens.
And if you're listening to this in the province of Alberta, where this is being recorded on my end, you are going through the year of the government's implementation of a no phone policy in your school right now and unpacking that. And I hope at this point of the time where you're listening here in December, you've seen some kind of positive difference from where it could be. And it brings me back to two people again. I talked about John Hattie earlier and his visible learning matrix. One of his elements he looked at was one-to-one personal electronic devices. Not effective. Didn't help people grow. Didn't help people learn. Wasn't significant towards learning. And Dr. Jody Carrington says this best: you can't send a dick pic on pen and paper. You can't bully somebody the same way you can on a phone and pen and paper. There's a lot of social emotional sides of things that go away when you go back to the pen and paper.
You can't game on pen and paper, right? You can't be gaming. You can't be doing
there's
all
tic-tac-toe and there's those old whatever, I don't know what they were. You used to fold them up, and
people get pretty bored with those pretty quickly, right?
There you
go.
Yeah.
The others, the gaming online is a whole different ballgame.
Yeah. So, Mark, this is the spark in us. This is the fire which embodies decision making and the risks taking. What's been one of the riskiest decisions you've made in your career, particularly when transitioning from academic research to public education and consulting? And what was the outcome?
Taking voluntary redundancy in the middle of COVID was probably the riskiest thing I've ever done. It was probably the stupidest thing I've ever done too. That was the riskiest thing I ever did, and I did have a lot of sleepless nights. I'm not now, but I did then. And at that time, I thought COVID was over, and it wasn't. And so that hit me pretty hard. But I then transitioned and wrote the book that I'd wanted to write for a long time and hadn't had the time to write. So that was great that I had that opportunity, and that's been really beneficial. And things since then, of course, have picked up enormously since then. So it's been great, but it was hard doing that. It was also, there was a lot of frustration. I found quite a bit of frustration and I'm not sure if this happens in Canada, but here in Australia, they usually have I hit my microphone. They usually have a deputy principal of health and wellbeing, and then they have a deputy principal of learning. And the funding for those two things is two different baskets. And when I go to a school, or when a school asks me, what can we do together, they're like, well, that's both health and wellbeing and it's learning outcomes. And so where does this come from? And who do you talk to? And I find, and I'm like, the two things mesh, right? The two things are so interrelated. You can't have them as two separate things. Yet schools here, I don't know if in Canada they are too, but schools here very much see them as two different things. And I don't at all. And so I have a bit of trouble getting that across the line, just because my work is on both, because both impact both. Really, really good students who are doing really well at school don't have emotional and health problems, right? They don't skip school, and so yeah, we've got to realize the two things are interwoven, and the two things interact with each other constantly.
And we have such a range here in Canada. It really depends on the division. Some divisions will have their superintendent and then a superintendent of human resources and a superintendent of learning, where the human resources is more for the teachers and the learning is for the students and the parents. But they're always collaborating too. And some of the best divisions out there just have a superintendent and two assistant superintendents, unbranded with titles and roles for what they do. And they just collaborate on everything that comes their way. And it brings back that collaborative mindset and establishing collective efficacy.
Yay.
Yeah. Yeah, so some places here do it extremely, extremely well. Now, sticking to this idea of risk, leaving a secure academic position to focus on public education and consulting is a bold move. What motivated this decision, and how has it shaped your mission to create a brain-healthy world?
Oh, yeah, it was actually multiple things. So my kids started going to school. I had children, and they started going to school. And the primary school that they were at, the principal there heard who I was and what I was doing, and he asked me to come in and do a few things there at the school with him, because he was starting to allow devices to be used in the school, and he wanted to know what the research around it was. So I talked to him, and then we changed a few things in relation to a whole bunch of things, including getting the teachers to collaborate and so on, so that they all weren't writing their own curriculum and they were actually working with it. And then because of that, his director, which is the next level up, the director looks after a whole bunch of schools. So he then heard what I was doing and asked me to come and work with a bunch of his schools, his other schools, and to speak to them. And then the director above him then asked, hey, what are you doing? Come and talk to me. And I talked to all of his directors, and then a director up in Queensland asked me. So all of this was happening while I was still at university. And I saw the huge need for it. And I saw that there was a need out there for neuroscience into schools. And I saw a couple of things in this area that weren't based on the latest research, and that really annoyed me. And I was like, hang on. And teachers going, this, neuroscience in learning doesn't work. And I'm like, well, yeah, because you're using research that isn't valid research, and this isn't good research, and here's the actual good research. And so, yeah, that all spurred me on to do it. And at the same time, I was asked to be involved in what they call the LEAP program, which is going out to low socioeconomic areas and going out to remote areas and working with schools out in those areas. And I found that hugely rewarding. So after a couple of years doing all of that, I sort of put all that together and went, yeah, I know I want to do this, and I want to do it on a bigger scale, and I want to have a bigger impact. And I was getting a bit jaded with universities, to be honest. I spent a lot of time talking to other academics, and a lot of time writing research papers that never got read by anyone but academics. And so I wanted to make a bigger impact than that. And I figured I'd got to the point in my career where I felt like I'd achieved everything I wanted to achieve in academia, and I wanted to let the next generation have a go. And I wanted to go out there and make a bigger impact.
And Mark, I love that you bring up it wasn't good research, because research is out there, and research is out there for both sides of the argument. And it's our due diligence and responsibility to look at the work out there and make an informed decision, and a data informed decision. And that's why bringing it back to collaboration is so important, because of how much research is out there. You as a singularity can only see so much. You can only review so much. And you need that broad perspective of, if I'm working with a multidisciplinary team, I'm asking people, can you go find things that contradict this in the research? Can you try to find things that support it? Can you find things that are indifferent? And let's ubiquitously look at this, and let's unpack, what does this look like holistically so I can make my most informed decision. So talking to the good research, it's good to hear that that's something that's being preached over there too. And let us know when you bring the consultation side to Canada. We would love to see you come our way.
That would be awesome. Yeah, I love Canada. When I was in MIT, I used to go up to Montreal and those areas quite a bit, and I've been to British Columbia as well a few times. It's a beautiful country, beautiful country.
Yeah,
and I love.
We'll make a point of not there. Oh, okay. Well, I was just going to say we'll make a point of not bringing you in February because of how cold we get. But maybe there's some snowboarding in there for you. Yeah, there you go. So, Mark, in your neuroscience programs, how do you encourage schools and businesses to take the necessary risks to implement the changes you advocate, especially when these changes challenge traditional practices or beliefs?
I don't think most of the time I do actually challenge the traditional beliefs, because a lot of the time I have teachers go, "Oh, that makes so much sense. It's great to see the research that actually shows why what I do works, and now I can tell everyone else." So I do often have that. So I'll either have teachers going, "Oh, that makes so much sense, I'm going to implement that today," or they go, "I already do that, but I didn't realize that's why I was doing it," with the good teachers, with the really good teachers. And there's a huge amount of amazing teachers who do it by gut, and have tried different things and have come up with the right way of doing it. And it turns out that the neuroscience shows that's the way you should do it as well, which is awesome because it makes it so much easier then to transition. And then sometimes, there are teachers who don't want to transition, or see it as a little bit more work, but it's never more work, right? Because once you actually connect with the students and once students are actually achieving, it's so much easier in the classroom because you don't have the behavioral problems and you're not constantly, having to stop to get kids to listen or get kids to focus or get kids to do things. So, it actually is less work when you're doing it in a way which is optimized for the brain, because then even kids with ADHD or with autism, they focus so much more when you're doing it in a way which is optimal for them.
Now we're getting close to the end of the show here, and I get to ask some of my favorite questions, and this one is for the audience and the listeners and the alchemists that are trying to make a difference. What are you hoping people listening action in their lives tomorrow from your message, Mark?
Turn off all your notifications on your device, all your devices, because that is just the cue that sets off the behavior which reinforces the addiction to the device. So turn off all your notifications so that you're not distracted by it. And we know that people's mental health improves within 2 weeks after they've turned off all the notifications. So please do that. You won't. The benefits are amazing. The second one is spend time with people, real people. We now know, based on the Harvard study, which has been going on for 75 years, that the number one way to actually improve your mental health and to improve your cardiovascular system, so get physically healthier and increase your lifespan by 10 to 15 years and decrease the likelihood of you having Alzheimer's disease, is to sit down with someone you trust on a regular basis and just talk to them. Right? And that we're not doing enough. Nobody has enough friends. We need to be spending time with people in real life, face to face, without the devices there, and chatting to them, because we know that activates more of your brain than anything else you can do. That actually improves your IQ. If you're a teacher, get your students to sit down and chat to each other, because that improves their IQ. That's probably the best thing you can actually get them to do. So those would be the two things I would say. Please.
Well, thank you so much, Mark, for putting a device in front of you, connecting with me and having a conversation. I'm thankful for this. And, it can be difficult for somebody, like we said earlier, to turn off that notification, to put that phone away for a bit. It's an addiction, and it acts as similar to, the body's response of when you're going through an addiction, or when you're going through even a nutrition change. And they talk about how when somebody tries that 30-day routine, it usually is ineffective, because it takes 2 to 5 weeks for your body to start responding to what you're doing. So you have to be consistent. You have to be resilient in what you're doing. Now, what does your future look like?
Pretty amazing. I'm having a ball at the moment. I get to go to, different. I get to meet different people constantly. I get to work with people I like working with, which is fantastic. I get to choose who I'm working with, which is amazing. Tonight I've got a parent event. It's going to be over 400 parents at the event who want to know about the devices, which is really fantastic. Earlier this year, I was at a Aboriginal community out in the middle of Australia, which is out in the middle of the desert, which was amazing to spend a week in a school, which is just for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids, and the community's restricted, so we had to get permission to go on to the area, which was amazing. But then I went to a conference over in Bali and presented at that called Live It Up, where I was the keynote and did a workshop for real estate agents, which is completely different. It's different every day, which I love and I'm enjoying, and I get to also go over. I have several people who sponsor me to work with kids who are in gangs and so on, and I love doing that as well. So it's so different and varied, and I have the opportunity to work with some amazing people and travel a lot. I get sick of the airports, but other than that, it's really, really cool, and I get to do stuff that I hope is going to make an impact on a couple of people.
That sounds very fun. I'm going to bring it back to collaborative. Very collaborative.
Oh yeah.
Very rooted in everything you believe in and stand for. And so we know that that's going to be successful, and you're going to have fun doing it because it's right where you want to be. For people listening that love the message, they want to hear more, what's the best way for them to connect with you?
Yeah, if you go to my website, which is just drmarkwilliams.com, there's lots of stuff on there. You can organise a time to catch up if you want to do that, or email me through there, or check out a bunch of different things that I've done on there and blogs and so on if you want to read those and keep up with what I'm doing. And also you can sign up to the newsletter as well hear where I'm going to be.
There we go. And alchemists, from kindy kids to adults, it's important to remember that approaching things with a collaborative mindset, 2 horse versus 1 horse, that 2 horse can pull 3 times the amount versus 1 horse being able to pull 1 times. Get collaborating, use your collective efficacy, work together. Dr. Mark Williams, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to join me on the Elemental Educator podcast.
Well, thank you so much, Tyler, for having me.
You've been listening to The Elemental Educator. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, review, and subscribe. We'll be back soon, but in the meantime, find us on Instagram, Facebook, and X at Elemental Educator.